The summer of 2010 came with an unexpected invitation that caught me off guard. My biological father, who had walked out of my life 5 years earlier, wanted to reconnect. I was 9 years old, a child still grappling with the absence he'd left behind. My brother, older and angrier, refused to entertain the idea. He made his choice, my brother spat when my mom brought it up, but I wasn't so sure. Part of me, naive and hopeful, thought maybe he'd changed. Maybe the years had softened the man who had once been my hero. I wanted to believe he regretted leaving us for someone else. So when he asked if I'd spend a weekend at his new home with his girlfriend and her kids, I said yes. My mom wasn't thrilled. She hesitated at first, pacing the kitchen and chewing her bottom lip. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," she reminded me more than once. But I insisted. I thought maybe this was my chance to have my dad back, to patch up the gaping hole his absence had left. The first visit wasn't so bad. I met John and Stuart, my father's girlfriend's 2 sons. John was about 11 or 12, a lanky kid with mischievous eyes and a grin that never quite reached them. Stuart, much younger, was a hyperball of energy who spent most of the day running in circles. John and I played games in the backyard, while my father hovered nearby, making awkward attempts at small talk. I remember feeling a flicker of hope. Maybe this could work. Maybe this was the start of something new. But the second visit was different. The weekend felt longer, the hours dragging by in a haze of unease I couldn't quite name. My father seemed distracted, spending most of his time with his girlfriend. Stuart clung to her, leaving John and me alone for hours. At first it was fine. We played tag, hide-and-seek, and card games, but by the second day the novelty wore off and John grew restless. "We should play something else," he said, his grin twisting into something sharper, something fun. I sat cross-legged on the carpet, shuffling a deck of cards. "Like what?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let's have sex." The words hit me like a slap. I froze, my fingers fumbling with the cards. "What? You heard me?" His tone was casual, like he was suggesting we play Monopoly. I shook my head quickly. No. Why not? It's John didn't like hearing no. His eyes narrowed and he leaned closer, almost too close. The air between us felt thick and suffocating. My heart pounded in my chest as I instinctively pulled back, but he wasn't done. "You're being a baby," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "It's just a game. Everyone does it." I felt a surge of panic. I wanted to scream, to push him away, but the words caught in my throat. Something deep inside me knew this wasn't right, that this wasn't the kind of game I wanted to play, but I also knew that saying no too firmly would only make things worse. It would make me the bad guy. It would make him angry. It would make everything worse. The thought terrified me, so I stayed silent, my mind racing. I tried to shrink into myself, hoping that if I made myself small enough he'd forget about it, and everything would go back to normal. But it didn't. John's hand brushed against mine, and I froze. His fingers were cold, and the touch made my skin crawl. I wanted to pull away, but something in me, fear, shame, confusion, kept me rooted to the spot. He was smiling now, a twisted grin that sent a chill down my spine. I could see the satisfaction in his eyes, like he was in control, and I was just an unwilling participant in his game. We continued playing cards, but every time I lost, I felt his gaze on me, heavy and unblinking. It was like he was waiting for the moment when I'd finally give in, when I'd let him have his way. And each time I won, I felt a small, fleeting sense of victory, but it was always overshadowed by the fear of what might happen next. At one point when I won a round, he leaned in close, his breath hot on my ear. "You know the rules," he whispered. "Touch me. It's part of the game." I recoiled, the disgust washing over me in waves. But I didn't say anything. I couldn't, not without making things worse. So I did it, reluctantly, because I didn't want him to get angry, because I didn't want to be the one who ruined everything. The whole experience felt like a blur, like I was floating above my own body, watching everything happen but unable to stop it. It was a sickening feeling, like I wasn't even in control of my own actions anymore. When the weekend finally ended, I was relieved to leave. My dad drove me home, and the silence in the car was unbearable. I stared out the window, trying to block out the images of what had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The touch. The game. John's grin. As soon as we arrived, I rushed inside, my heart racing. I didn't want to be near anyone. I didn't want to talk. But my mom noticed something was wrong immediately. She asked if everything was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. The words felt like they were lodged in my throat, stuck between what had happened and the fear of how my mom would react. That night, after dinner, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned in my bed, the memories replaying over and over again in my mind. Every time I closed head in my pillow, my body trembling. I didn't want to face her. I didn't want to tell her what had happened because I was terrified of her reaction. What would she think of me? Would she blame me for not saying something sooner? Would she be angry? I tried to push the feelings down, but they came flooding out in a rush, and I felt a lump form in my throat. "Mom," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "John, he touched me." The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. For a moment, everything was still. My mom's breath caught, and I could feel her standing there, frozen, processing what I had just said. She knelt beside my bed, her hand gently brushing my hair. "What happened?" she asked softly, her voice shaking with concern. I choked on my words, the floodgates opening as everything came tumbling out. I told her about the cards, the touches, the uncomfortable feeling that had settled deep inside me. But I didn't tell her everything. I didn't tell her about the way John had pressured me, how I had been too scared to say no because I thought I would be hated for it. I couldn't tell her, I wasn't ready, but my mom, she could see it in my eyes. She could feel the pain in my voice. She didn't need all the details, she knew, her arms wrapped around me tightly, pulling me into a comforting embrace. "You're safe now," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. You didn't deserve that." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was mixed with guilt. I hadn't told her the whole truth, and I knew it, but just being in her arms, feeling her warmth, made the weight in my chest feel a little lighter. The next few days were a blur. My mom made sure to call my biological father. The confrontation was tense, and I could hear their raised voices from across the house. I didn't know what was being said, but I could feel the anger and frustration on both sides. My dad didn't believe me at first. He didn't understand why I hadn't said anything sooner, why I hadn't told him directly. But my mom stood firm, and after a long, painful conversation, he agreed to make things right. He promised that John would be kept away from me, that he would take responsibility for what had happened. But I knew that wasn't enough. The damage had already been done. As the weeks went by, I struggled with what had happened. I was still haunted by the memory of those moments, the touch that I couldn't forget, no matter how hard I tried. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw John's face. Every time I touched my own skin, I felt the lingering discomfort of what had been taken from me. But I also began to heal. Slowly, painfully, I began to piece myself back together. I talked to my mom more. I started to open up about my fears, my confusion, and my anger. And she listened, without judgment, without anger. She helped me understand that none of this was my fault, that I wasn't responsible for what had happened. It took time. It took a lot of time. But gradually I started to feel like myself again. The weight of silence lifted, replaced by the strength of my voice. As I grew older, the memories didn't fade completely, but they became quieter. I learned how to carry them with me, how to acknowledge the scars without letting them define me. I found comfort in my own skin again, learning that I could reclaim what had been taken. By the time I was in my late teens, I had learned to forgive myself for not speaking up sooner. I had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the pain and finding a way to move forward despite it. And when I met my partner, someone who saw me for who I was, not defined by what had happened in my past, I knew I had finally found a place of safety. I could share my fears, my desires, my dreams without shame. I could be loved and love in return, free from the weight of my past. I didn't forget what happened, I didn't erase it, but I learned to make peace with it. I learned that I was more than the trauma I had experienced. I was more than the girl who had been silenced by fear. I was stronger than I had ever known. And for the first time in a long time, I could look at myself in the mirror and feel whole again.